This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. This is a show about opening up the often mysterious world of how doctors think. The goal? To empower the listener to gain access to the best health care possible.
Day and welcome to Medicine Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. That's me. I am Dr. Paul, and today we have this topic of aluminum in your brain. Maybe not your brain, but aluminum and the brain. This is something that people have been hearing about for decades at this point, but one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it today on the podcast is there's a lot of newer information, even up until the last, say, 12 months, being published around aluminum and disease, and then aluminum and diseases that affect your central nervous system, your brain, and your spinal cord. And I think that it's a worthy topic because there's always, with these things, they're very complicated. There's confusion around them. And there's also sort of this history around the science of aluminum and brain dysfunction that's gone kind of up and down and back and forth. But if you've never watched the podcast before or watched any of my YouTubes or anything, it's Medicine Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. I'm Dr. A, that's me. And for the last 3 decades, I've been a researcher, writer, physician, teacher, all sorts of other things. And I try and answer questions that people have that relate to medicine, health, and science. And I tried my best where possible to break it down so it is not only memorable, but meaningful as well. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is if aluminum is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and it's bad for you, especially bad for your brain, what do you do about that? So it's always nice to know, that we live in this toxic world, and there's all these chemicals that we didn't really have a lot around a long time ago, and now we do. And then there's things that are in the environment that are just natural to the environment, like say aluminum or lead or some other thing, but they weren't really friendly with humans and other mammals. And that's all sort of good intellectual information to have that there's these toxins we're exposed to. But what does it really mean? Like, how dangerous are they? And then ultimately, where would they be coming into my body? And what would they be doing specifically health-wise? And then, what would I do to minimize the effect that the, in this case, aluminum is having on me? So one of the things I think that comes up, because I hear about it a lot, is people will say, well, I heard that they disproved the connection between, say, aluminum and Alzheimer's disease, or I hear that they disproved that aluminum was really any problem or anything like that. Well, as I said, the idea of aluminum and disease has gone back and forth, like a ping pong ball for a long, long time. And if you go back, I don't know, 30 years, there's, older papers that have these associations maybe between Alzheimer's, dementia, and aluminum, but they weren't really sure how or why or if it was even a real effect or anything. And then you had papers that said, well, we don't think that's going on. And then there's these other theories that develop around some of these brain diseases. But one of the things that got my attention was a paper, and if you go to nature.com, so it's in the Nature Reviews science world of periodicals, but Nature is a very well respected scientific journal, and they have a lot of sub journals that they do. So just Nature, natura.com. In their scientific reports section, there's the two authors are Exley, Exley, and Clarkson, Clarkson. It's a 2020 paper, so just months old at this point. And it is aluminum in human brain tissue from donors with and without neurodegenerative disease. Now, as soon as you start hearing about people taking brains apart and people who are donors of brain, they obviously are all deceased. So these are not from living people, but these are people who donated their brains. And what they did is they took a reasonable number of brains that came from people that had particular neurodegenerative type diseases, and then they matched those to a similar number of people who did not have any of those neurological diseases. All were dead, all were of similar age, as you might imagine with donation coming from people who have passed away. You're going to have similar ages for the most part, except for a few outliers. Well, when they looked at them, and they looked specifically at two kinds of Alzheimer's disease, so sporadic Alzheimer's disease and then heritable familial Alzheimer's disease. So two kinds of Alzheimer's disease, and they looked at the autism spectrum, and then they also looked at multiple sclerosis. And so they had this big bunch of donated brains with people with both kinds of Alzheimer's disease, autism spectrum, and then multiple sclerosis. And they did very specific testing on the amount of aluminum in those brains and also the locations that they found the aluminum as well. Now, if you're really interested in this and interested in looking at some of those finer details that aren't really germane to what we're going to talk about today, you can go on nature.com, and if you put in Exley and Clarkson, Exley and Clarkson 2020, and just put aluminum, I bet you'll come right up with this particular paper. And it's a free full text online if you want to go reading it. And they go into a lot of the finer points about it. So we're not going to get into those, but where did the aluminum like to go in this disease versus that disease? But then they said, well, okay. And I got this comment today, actually. I was telling someone I was going to talk about this and on the radio or on the podcast, and they said, well, yeah, so what? Everybody gets exposed to aluminum. Everyone's got aluminum in their brains. Well, true, we all get exposed to aluminum, but what this paper really did that other papers have done, but this one I think did it better statistically, is they said, okay, all these neurological disease patients who have died had a lot of aluminum in their brains. What if we got a whole bunch of people that didn't have neurological disease? Would they have the same amount of aluminum? Everybody's got aluminum, but the people without neurological disease did not have very much aluminum in their brains compared to the people with the neurological disease. So that is a really important part of the story here. Okay, so when you look at that, one of the other things to kind of go hunting for, and we talked about this before with respect to other treatments and things, the statistics, when you do a paper and you look at the statistics behind what you found, there's supposed to be a usually predetermined level of the statistics meeting what we call significance. So remember, if you're a frequent listener, back with some of the papers around, for example, the most recent one we talked about was the paper that said COVID is not helped by people taking vitamin C and zinc, and they did this study and that said it didn't help. But when you looked at their statistics, none of the statistics reached statistical significance, meaning they don't mean anything. Okay, they're sort of random, and so you can make up anything you want out of that, but it's not terribly intellectually on track to do that. This one, their statistics were predetermined that a certain level, a certain p-value would be considered significant. And usually when you do these things and you're doing research, you have statisticians do this because that's a whole science unto itself. And this paper did reach statistical significance across the board. So the bottom line is, if you had these two kinds of Alzheimer's, autism spectrum, multiple sclerosis, you had much higher aluminum in the brain than if you had none of those neurological diseases. And that was borne out through their research, through looking for the aluminum, and also just through their statistical analysis. Now, the next step that usually comes in then is, well, I thought, this is another comment, that I've heard is, well, I thought it's, we now understand it's much more than just, something like an insult, like a trauma or a metal like aluminum or something that is at the base of these neurodegenerative problems. And so why are we, just blaming aluminum? Well, the important part about this, and they talk about it in the paper, is it's not so much that we're blaming the aluminum, although the aluminum has sort of an incendiary starting issue that it does, but aluminum is related to some of the other pathological problems that we see in these neurodegenerative problems. So I started to go, hunting to see, well, is there anything recently published in the science that would say, well, aluminum has a relationship to this other thing that we know that is a very big problem in a lot of neurological dysfunction, and that is beta amyloid protein deposition. So amyloid is a type of protein, beta is a type of the amyloid, and what happens is that the proteins are big, strings of amino acids, and they fold and fold until you get a larger structure, a tertiary or quaternary protein structure, and then you have this big lumbering thing. Well, the folding can make a difference in how much obstruction the protein has, for example, or how much damage to the local area it does, etc. Well, it turns out that a couple of, and this is just two, I looked at a lot of them, a couple of them, one was a very recent paper in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, so there literally is a Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. Lead author was Matthew Mold, M-O-L-D, and that was from 2020. And the paper is aluminum and amyloid beta deposition. So if you look at Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, Matthew Mold, and aluminum, you'll find that paper pretty easily. And then there was another one from a few years prior, the Arabian Journal of Chemistry, 2015. This is by Dr. Zhang et al., Z-H-A-N-G, and many other authors, the effects of aluminum on amyloid beta. And if you look at these papers, what they say is, they understand because they've read all science for the last 40 years, and they understand that, we have this problem where these amyloid proteins get in the wrong places, create neurological problems. And then we also have this history of knowing that aluminum seems to show up in these neurological problems, etc. So maybe they're related. Well, it turns out that when you have the formation of things like beta amyloid, these proteins in the nervous system, that is very bad for neurological function. Also, on its own, aluminum is not great for neurological function for reasons that we'll talk about. But apparently, when you put aluminum together in a brain with the starting of beta amyloid formation, the aluminum creates this misfolding that goes on that makes the amyloid more dangerous and more damaging to the brain. So it's one of those things where it's hard to tell, which comes first. Is it that, the amyloid's there and then you pepper some aluminum in there and then it goes? Or is the aluminum just sticking around and now you have a lot of aluminum and now you're forming these amyloid proteins and that speeds up the formation of amyloid? Whichever way it goes, neither is good and together they're worse. So they have negative synergy inside of your brain. Now, this then begs the question, if the people with the neurological diseases after they died, brains are donated and they look, there's a lot of aluminum in the brains of the people with neurological diseases, and the people with no neurological disease, there's not as much aluminum in their brains, then it begs the question, well, if everybody gets exposed to aluminum, and yes, we are all exposed constantly to aluminum, why would the people with the neurological diseases have more aluminum? And is there anybody else in the world that has more aluminum than people who are not unhealthy? So well people versus sick people. Well, another really common area is, and this has been very well known for decades and decades and decades, is people with kidney problems. Because a lot of, if you get exposed as you do every day to aluminum, a lot of aluminum is eliminated through the kidneys. So you can imagine if your body has a slow kidney function, you're going to have trouble getting rid of the aluminum, and your body will have a higher level of aluminum. So one of the most simple correlations is people with kidney function problems. But then there were other things. For example, back when our clinic had very large populations of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, we, on their initial testing and on their follow-up testing, we would always test them for aluminum. And it was very common to find people with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue that had high levels of aluminum, especially in their blood, meaning that either they were exposed to an excessive degree or they were unable to eliminate it like other people did. And the interesting thing with most of these patients was their kidneys worked fine. And as a matter of fact, when we would give them things to help their body eliminate aluminum, their aluminum levels would go down. But then it started to beg the question, well, with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, what do we have going on that might be related to neurological problems? Well, one thing is there's a lot of neurological issues in chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, whether they're related to pain, neurohormonal control, sleep-wake cycles, other brain things, quote unquote. There's also a lot of peripheral pain, muscle pain, nerve pain, etc., that could be exacerbated by the presence of the aluminum as well. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, people would improve when you would work with them to get their aluminum levels down. So help the body to eliminate. So when we think about that, and we think now that there's these other disease states that aluminum's associated with, it's not that crazy of an idea that maybe piggybacking on amyloid deposition and all these other things that go on in neurological dysfunction and disease, that we might have aluminum problems elsewhere. Now, in a paper called Aluminum Toxicosis, that sounds like a really exciting one. But in this particular paper, this is just a sheet out of it that I have because I want to read directly from some information they gave about how do we get aluminum. It's a really good paper. the bottom line is it's in a paper called Interdisciplinary Toxicology. It was published in 2019, so just a year and a half, 2 years ago. And the lead author is IGBOKWE, and I believe that's Igbauke et al. Aluminum toxicosis. So if you look at the papers, and this is just one of the pages out of this particular paper, but if you look at papers over time, the idea of toxic aluminum effect on humans, it goes back decades and decades. This paper here, and the reason I'm mentioning it, not just because it's a very new paper from 2019, but it probably does the best job of tying up a lot of these loose ends of what do we know about how we get aluminum in as humans? What do we know about how it messes our body up as a toxin? And what do we know about what it does to other processes that make us even sicker? And then it gets to, the so-called $1 million question. Well, if aluminum is that bad, is there anything I can do about it? Which is an incredibly good question to have. So just wanted to look at a few things. And this, I'm going to go directly from this particular paper, again, 2019 in the journal Interdisciplinary Toxicology, 2019 by Dr. IGBOKWE, so I do not butcher his or her last name. But what do they say are the ways that it gets into humans? So toxicology is a study of toxins going into animals or humans. How do we get it? Well, the first arm of their description, again, you get this paper full text. It's got really great diagrams in it if you're into that sort of thing. The first one is aerosolized, and this is inhaled through the lung. Inhaled through the lung, it's going to aluminum very easily goes into the circulation, and it increases your aluminum levels. Now you think, oh gosh, how am I getting aerosolized aluminum? Well, if you want to really get into it, you can look up sources of aerosolized aluminum or sources of aluminum you breathe in through your lungs or anything else, and you'll see a number of ways that goes on. One of the things that I recall, and this is going back to the 1960s, but I grew up on a cattle ranch, and we were in the Columbia River Valley Gorge area, and down the Columbia River from where the ranches were that we were on, there were two large aluminum producing plants, and they made things like your aluminum foil and aluminum wires and all kinds of aluminum things. And then for industry, they made ingots of aluminum that they would ship all over the world for people to make other things out of aluminum. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, we weren't quite as concerned about toxicology with respect to a lot of things that we're concerned about now. And I remember if the wind would blow a certain way from these two particular aluminum plants, and I won't name them because I don't want anyone to sue me, but they're two pretty big names in aluminum. If the wind blew a certain way, you would see these really pretty flakes in the ground. And there were places on the ranch and places I used to roam where there would be creeks, that would form just due to runoff water, and you'd see these shiny things in the creeks. And I remember thinking, I wonder if it's a precious metal. It turned out it was fallout from the aluminum plants. Well, so if that can happen, and let's say even we've tightened up some of our parameters on what we let out into the world for people to breathe, there's still aluminum in the air from many sources. And as I said, you can look those up. I don't want to enumerate many of them just because I prefer not to have any of those folks sue me, but it still happens. Now, interestingly, one of the things you're going to see in sort of the rest of the story coming up here is aluminum has synergy and competition with other metals and minerals in your body. And one of the things that happened to a lot of the livestock in this particular area was an outbreak of copper deficiency, which is kind of unusual if the animals are eating the normal things that you feed animals that have a lot of minerals in them. But it turns out that aluminum is it's not quite competitive with copper, but it disorders copper metabolism. You see this also with iron and a few other things. So one of the reasons probably behind some of the copper deficiency that we saw in some of the livestock was, probably not all, but partly due to this exposure of aluminum going into their feed. They're being fed a high aluminum content, alfalfa and grass hay and other things, and you didn't realize it, which we didn't till it was too late. So then what other ways? Well, water. You need to know that any water you drink anywhere, unless it's something really hyper cleaned like a reverse osmosis or something, any water is going to have aluminum in it. And that includes, so you think about it, the water put onto your crops to make your food. So food's another source. And then also medicines. And they list right here, medicines are number 3 under water and food as far as things that you would eat and ingest through your digestive tract as a way to get aluminum. Now there's medicines that have aluminum in them, like certain antacids and other things, for maybe, chemical reasons. And then there are things that aluminum is in, such as excipients and other things to make medicine, where you're just, when you take your pill, you're getting a little dose of aluminum with it, just like when you drink any water or eat any food. Well, then that of course gets digested, goes into your blood too. So you can breathe it in, you can eat it. And then if that wasn't enough, and again, this comes from this paper in the toxicology journal I mentioned. The other way is what we would call parenteral. Well, what does that mean? So enterum means eating through the gut. Parenteral means injecting. So they say, well, if you get dialysis, you can have aluminum. And already I've got a problem because your kidneys aren't working if you're getting dialysis. So there's aluminum balance issues. Infusions, IV solutions, a lot of them have a lot of aluminum, not because they're trying to have aluminum, but because it's in the background water that goes in the IV solution. And to their credit, one of the things that the Food and Drug Administration did about 12 years ago was enforced a lowering of aluminum levels in most parenteral drug products. But then the third thing that they mention is vaccines. Now, many vaccines, because the background water has aluminum, they have aluminum in them as well. So parenteral treatment is another way to get aluminum in. So we can breathe it in, we can get it injected, or we can eat and drink it. Those are the big ways that it goes in. Now, are there things that would increase the absorption of aluminum? So let's just say we're not getting any shots and IVs and stuff, and we're not on dialysis, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's say our air quality is pretty good. Good luck finding good air quality, but let's say our air quality is pretty good. We're still eating and drinking, right? Even if we're not taking any medicine. So is absorption of aluminum increased by anything? Well, indeed, anything that lowers your kidney function will increase your absorption of aluminum. If you are deficient in calcium and magnesium, that's one of the biggest ways for you to hyperabsorb aluminum. In fact, in the what I'll call the olden days, a few decades ago, one of the things we would do first off with people that had a lot of aluminum would give them extra calcium and magnesium. That is good for you. And there are other potential things that can increase it as well. But then you have to say, well, doesn't the body have a natural way to get rid of aluminum? Yeah, it does, like everything else. Your kidneys are huge, so going out through the urine, which is why if you have kidney disease, your excretion of aluminum is going to be slower, and you don't want that, but that'll happen. The other is out through the digestive route, which would be through your liver forming bile, the bile having different toxins in it. It goes out. Bile has a digestive aspect that it does. And so you want the bile then to go be used up and go out in the feces in your stool. One of the reasons why increased fiber helps people in detoxifying is the fiber will soak up the bile and not let the bile reabsorb. So imagine if you made this bile and then the bile's these toxins, gets in your digestive tract, it helps with your digestion. At a certain point in your digestive tract, the bile is set to be reabsorbed in the blood. Well, if you have a bunch of toxins in your bile, that's the last thing that you want, is to have the reabsorption of that bile and the toxins back in. So when we say bile and out through the stool, what we also want to think about is fiber is really important. Start with the fiber you get in your diet. And in some cases where we have people who are detoxifying a lot, we may give them extra fiber as a supplement, but start with just more fiber in your food. There's some of my other YouTube videos. You go to my YouTube channel, Dr. A Online YouTube. You'll see those other videos that get into that more specifically. You also can sweat it out. So it's been now shown over a number of papers that we actually have metals, toxic metals in our sweat. And that's a good thing, because the more we sweat, you put the fluids in, you sweat them out, you're going to sweat out toxins. Aluminum is one of the things that you can find in the sweat. You can also find it in just about anything that comes out of your body. And one of the things to be thoughtful about is, if you're concerned about mom to child transmission, aluminum is transmitted through the milk. So if mom is nursing, it's going to be like a lot of other things. You don't want high amount of aluminum going in mom if mom is nursing, because baby's going to be getting the aluminum too. Now, yes, you can improve the removal of aluminum. You can decrease your sources of aluminum, and most people have a pretty good balance there. But if we go back to our original question of, if the research shows that in neurological disorders we have more aluminum in the brain, and we know that that aluminum triggers other bad processes in the brain, what is it about people with neurological problems or other things where they might keep more aluminum? Well, this is still a largely unanswered question. But what I can say from observation of patients over time is, aluminum is, and in this particular paper they say there is no aluminum homeostasis, meaning there is no purpose for aluminum in the human body, right? So it's never good for us. But some people seem to be able to handle what goes in, goes out pretty easily. Other people seem to build it up. Remember, I said the story about the chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and chronic illness patients often had more aluminum they were holding on to, but their kidneys technically worked fine. So somewhere in the metabolism of aluminum through a human, to get rid of it, such as is outlined in this toxicology paper here that you can get, um, there's a breakdown somewhere. And theoretically, that breakdown could be in a number of different types of chronic illness, such as neurological, and we may not have discovered why, what the exact breakdown is. Or like a lot of things, maybe the exact breakdown is a number of things. And so it's not just like one gene code that goes wrong. It's a whole bunch of things that makes you hold on to more aluminum. Now, since this is one of those things where we're trying to talk about why would aluminum still be a problem if it's in the background water and everybody's exposing all this. Is it really that bad? Well, from that same paper in the interdisciplinary toxicology world, they have this chart at the bottom. And again, so that I don't take anything out of context, what actions would aluminum have that would be bad for humans or other mammals? Well, they list a whole bunch, and so I'm not going to read all of them because A, it would take us a long time to read all of them. B, this depressing aluminum talk would get even more depressing, and my point is not to be depressing, it's just to make a point. But a couple of things. Oxidative stress is created by aluminum and lipid peroxidation. Now, what that means is lipid peroxidation means that your cell membranes are going to become oxidized. They're not going to work appropriately. And if there's something like a circulating lipid, like your LDL cholesterol, they're going to be more oxidized, they're going to be more damaging to you. You're going to have inflammatory disease triggering in many organs around your body. Aluminum is known in the research to especially inflame the intestinal tract, very large part of the real estate that is your body. Your heart, not a good idea there. Lungs, reproductive organs, etc. So it's not only giving you lipid peroxidation everywhere in your body, but also, lung, intestine, heart, reproductive organs, etc. It also is immunosuppressive. Well, that doesn't sound very good. And it's not. Immunosuppressive, anything is bad. It also gets, and this is one of the things that we were always trying to sort out with our chronic fatigue fibromyalgia, your fatigued, painful patients, was it gets in the act of impairing your normal metabolism in your cells. So it impairs the breakdown of sugar, it impairs the cycle that makes energy for you, and it can trigger a downstream mitochondrial dysfunction. None of that is good if you're already in a weakened, fatigued state. So aluminum is very, very bad in that respect as well. It, as we mentioned, increases amyloid deposition in the brain and nervous system tissues, and that is not a good thing. Another thing that most people don't realize is we hear about xenoestrogens or xenobiotics or other things. Xeno means outside toxic influence that makes an estrogen or some other thing. Now, these are not good estrogens or good hormones or whatever. So aluminum is actually what they consider a metalloestrogen, and it can actually trigger and promote breast cancer. That's in this toxicology paper as well. It disrupts mineral metabolism. Remember my story about the livestock becoming copper deficient? It is known in the research to disrupt mineral deposition in the body of important things like phosphorus, iron, calcium, zinc, copper, all sorts of other problems. So again, this theory that maybe the copper deficiency, which was a giant mystery at the time, again, this is going back to probably the late 1960s, if memory serves, that was all probably partly due to aluminum disrupting the uptake and distribution of very important minerals. There's also, if you're thinking about brains and neurological problems, there's a process that you want to have balanced that's a cell repair process, but aluminum tends to overexpress the cell repair process, and so you get a lot of cell death that you were not planning on because of the aluminum. You also remember you have lipid peroxidation at your cell membranes, It also messes with the electrical transport across cell membranes, which is one of the large ways that your body communicates, is by ions and electrical transmission through your body. It's also well known to create high blood pressure, which is obviously not good for you. It's been implicated as a cause of stroke and both thrombotic and other strokes. Aluminum is a known contact allergen, so some people get this from aluminum-based deodorants. They'll break out, that's from that. And it also inhibits vitamin D. Well, we already know vitamin D does everything good in your body when you got the right amounts. Aluminum is a known interrupter of vitamin D. So we made a pretty good and kind of a downer case that aluminum is not good for us. We also know that aluminum comes into us through many sources every single day. We know that it's in almost all the water you drink, almost all the water that your food is raised with, almost all the water you cook with, most of your food, certainly parenteral things like vaccines and injections and IV solutions and other stuff of that nature. And we know that we breathe it in. So there's just no way to avoid aluminum. The end game with aluminum is, why don't we keep the good stuff in the body so that we avoid the negative effects of the aluminum going in and depositing in the body. Now, first thing I want to say is, if you have kidney disease, so your kidney output is suppressed, that's very common. It's very common with people with a lot of other diseases. But what you need to know is, when your kidney output is suppressed, you're going to even have more of a problem getting rid of aluminum, because your kidneys do a very large job there. So then we want to think about, well, what are other ways to help? Well, there's a couple of things to consider here. The first thing would be to reduce your absorption through your skin, okay? Now you might think, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. You probably heard of, or you do it yourself, of people that look and they make sure that they don't use skin products like, deodorants and other products that have aluminum. That is a very wise thing to do. And if you think about it, especially like a deodorant where it's going, in your axilla, your underarm area, you've got a lot of very large pores. You've got a lot of very large glands there, sweat glands and other glands. And so if you put a bunch of aluminum there, it's going to absorb into the body rather readily. But another thing that can be done is, if you think about it, showering and bathing is another way where aluminum gets into the body, because aluminum's in all of the water supply. And so you can buy, shower head filters that will filter aluminum. There are some house-wide filters that do it, but just having ways that you're not, putting more water on you for your skin to soak up, because certainly it does come that way. Then there's also reducing your absorption in your GI tract. Now, a lot of that is the less that you eat and put in, then the less that you're going to absorb, but we'll talk about that coming up. Antioxidant treatment. This comes from this very conservative toxicology journal, but antioxidants, remember, most people are in an oxidative, pro-oxidative burn-in, meaning that they need antioxidants. Now, does that mean you should overdo antioxidants? No. Antioxidants and pro-oxidants have a balance in your body, but if you start out more oxidized than not, it's not a bad idea to have some antioxidants going through your system. Now, I want to say here, as I say in most of the shows, this is not medical advice. This is information from science. I'm just sharing it with you. You should talk to your doctor, your healthcare providers about anything before you do it. Please don't take medical advice from YouTube or podcasters or any of that without running it by a competent healthcare provider. But also make sure that they're a healthcare provider who's trained in the appropriate assessment and dosing of things like antioxidants and other things. So if you were to be working with someone who knew those things, they would be able to balance antioxidants for you that you may take in. Now, if you listen to any of the 100 COVID discussions or other antioxidant discussions we've had, you know that the water-soluble things like vitamin C are pretty innocuous. They can go in and we use them up every day. There's going to be certain trace minerals like zinc and selenium and other stuff. And remember, we usually like to take trace minerals as a mineral complex, not just one at a time. And as you might recall, aluminum will slow down the absorption of the goodies, but they also outcompete each other. So antioxidants become very, very useful. Also, these competitive inhibiting items like calcium and magnesium, very, very useful as you're going along. And then things like reduction of tissue accumulation. So if you look here, this is this paper, and this is sort of their wheel of what to do about aluminum. Again, that's from that Interdisciplinary Toxicology 2019 by Dr. I'll spell it Igbokwe et al. Aluminum toxicosis. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful paper. So you get that if you want to dig into it. But reducing tissue accumulation. So there's a couple things you can do. One is move your body, because tissue accumulation is largely in things like solid organs like your kidneys, liver, stuff like that. But also, what's the bigger one? Your muscles. Your muscles hold a lot of aluminum. If you do biopsies on people's muscles, the sicker people are, the more aluminum you find in their muscles in many cases. So moving your body, and you don't have to become an ultra marathoner, just moving your body and then sweating is one big way of reducing your body load, the overall load. Well, then what are other things? Now, if you get a high amount of aluminum, you go to the hospital, there is a chelation drug called deferoxamine, or Deferox, that is used to remove extra lead and other things like that, and it will remove some aluminum. But if you go back to what I was saying, that the discipline in medicine that's known about aluminum toxicity the longest is nephrology, the kidney specialist. The reason is that in poor kidney function, you build up aluminum, and also in dialysis, which is in the realm of nephrology, you build up aluminum as well. So they have been very, very careful about studying what will get rid of aluminum other than chelating someone with Deferox, the drug. Well, it turns out that organic acids are one way to get rid of aluminum. And you think, well, acid sounds kind of bad, there's bad connotations to acid. You think, like sulfuric acid or LSD acid or something. It's none of that. That's not what we're talking about. Organic acids are things that we make in our body, but we can take them in from exogenous outside places. And the number one remover of aluminum that is not a drug, you can get it in food, but really if you got a lot of aluminum, you should probably just buy some extra and take it, is called malic acid or malate, malic acid. Malic acid is used in our cells in particular steps of metabolism. It's very safe. And I've had people where they got into a big surge of aluminum from some outside source. The reason we tested them was they came in and they said, for the last week, I cannot think straight. And it was not that way. So some acute problem. Test their aluminum levels and they're super high. And we give them malic acid as a medical treatment, and we test them in a week and their aluminum levels are back down. And this is what all of the research that the kidney doctors have found as well. Now, again, this is not medical advice. You run this by your physician, healthcare provider, whoever's working with your aluminum problems. But what we would normally do if it was real bad, you can get malic acid in a powder form and they would just mix it into juice and take it. Or if they already needed some, say, magnesium, you could get a magnesium supplement that's magnesium malate, which is magnesium and malic acid together. And they would take that just every day as their magnesium supplement. And so the aluminum would be helped out. And this particular toxicology journal, like me, lists malic acid as their number one because it's much safer than a chelator like deferoxamine. You can take it every day, etc. Now, malic acid comes in most berries, cherries, plums, grapes. A lot of fruit has malic acid. The problem is you're going to have a hard time getting enough fruit to get the malic acid without getting kind of overdosed on sugar from the fruit. So most of the time getting enough malic acid from food is going to be a little bit tricky, but malic acid powder or magnesium malate is certainly available around the world. Again, only if your healthcare provider says it's okay. Citric acid, oxalic, and succinic acid, these are other organic acids. So citric acid, you might get that from citrus fruits, apples, other things of that nature. Antioxidants we mentioned, but especially things like vitamin C, selenium, zinc, all of these things, very, very useful as you go along. There are some other herb and herb related things that are very good, like fenugreek, grape seed, garlic, onions, number of other things that you can eat. That's all in that toxicology paper. There's also things like ginseng. Some people don't tolerate ginseng, some do, but people that have ginseng as a tea or as a supplement, that can be helpful. Chlorogenic acid, which is famous because it's in coffee and tea, also is very helpful with this, but chlorogenic acid's also in apples, pears, carrots, tomatoes, yams, a lot of other vegetables out there, fruit and vegetables, and then some other things that are very useful as well. But I think the bottom line is, if you have chronic illness, you should probably have your aluminum levels checked. Normally they'll do blood aluminum, and if that's high, you've got a lot of aluminum around. You want to remember that your body can eliminate it through its normal ways. So move your body, get your muscles moving, sweat, make sure that you're hydrated, get enough antioxidants, work with your healthcare provider on that. If you truly have aluminum that's elevated on a lab test, you want to be doing something to get rid of it. Again, your healthcare provider may use deferoxamine, or they may use malic acid. My recommendation would be malic acid or magnesium malate, whatever they want, but that would be my recommendation. And because so much comes in through water, you may want to consider filtration of your shower and bath water for aluminum, and also a water filter that is rated to remove aluminum or reduce aluminum. What some of my friends in the toxicology world do is they just either install a reverse osmosis system in their house, or they have a reverse osmosis water delivered. That's one of the ways to reduce. You can't ever eliminate aluminum, but it's one way to reduce the aluminum content in the water that you're getting. And then if you're having, procedures done where you're going to get a vaccination and it has aluminum in it, or you're going to get an IV or a shot or whatever, oftentimes malic acid is very, very useful as just a preventive to help flush the aluminum through. All right, well, we're running right down to the wire, and we've covered all of the good, the bad, and the ugly around aluminum, and how it is a big health problem, especially for the nervous system, but really for a lot of other systems. We've talked about the best ways to get rid of it, and also where it comes from in our world. But we are about to get the electronic hook here and be out of time. So I am Dr. Paul Anderson. You can check us out at DRANOW, dranow.com. That's the new website that's a hub for everything. So you want the YouTube channel or the newsletters or this show podcast or any of the other things we do, dranow.com, dranow.com. Get over there and take a look at that. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you all on the radio next week.
You've been listening to Medicine and Health with your host, Dr. Paul Anderson. Visit the clinic website at www.amsa1.com or call the clinic at 206-629-2186.